double the national rate. And also, importantly, and I think we're going to get into that a little bit tonight, they suffer from the highest rate of sexual harassment of any industry. And that situation has become worse as a result of the pandemic. And many of our women waitresses are forced to tolerate inappropriate customer behavior just to make a living and feed their families. As a recent report by One Fair Wage shows, 71% of women in the restaurant industry have been sexually harassed at least once on the job, and 44% have been sexually harassed by someone from management. So, what do we have to do? What we have to do is create an environment where sexual harassment does not take place. And one way we do that is making sure that our waiters and waitresses, people in the restaurant industry and hotels, are paid a living wage. And the Restaurant Association says that, workers in the industry, they really don't want to raise the tip wage. Well, that's really not true. There is a petition drive where I believe 140,000 workers signed a petition demanding to see that tip wage raised. So we got a whole lot to talk about this evening. You don't want to hear from me. Truth was, I was a waiter many, many years ago. And you know what? I go down in history as one of the worst waiters in the history of waiting. So I had to find another job, and here I am today. But being a waiter was not my thing. I didn't do it very well. And it's a hard job. I want everybody to know it. Being a waiter, being a waitress, being a busboy, whatever it is, it's tough work. So with that, let me introduce somebody who is doing a great job in helping to organize waitresses and waiters all over this country to fight for decent wages and dignity on the job. And that is Saru Jayaharaman, who is the co-founder and president of One Fair Wage. Saru, thank you very much for all the work you're doing, and thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Senator Sanders, for your leadership on this issue and so many other issues. We couldn't agree with you more that right now raising the minimum wage and ending the sub-minimum wage is one of the most important things we have to do as a country, not only to reduce income inequality and make sure people can survive, but also to jumpstart this very depressed economy. So I want to share a little bit of history first, because it's so important to know where this ridiculous $2 wage comes from. The restaurant industry prior to the pandemic was one of the largest and fastest growing private sector employers in the United States, but it was also the absolute lowest paying. It actually has been the lowest paying employer for many generations. And that is because of the money, power, and influence of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA. And the other NRA, which represents the chains, the IHOPs, the Applebee's, the Denny's, has been around for a very long time. Actually, it's been around in various forms since emancipation of slavery. Now, just before emancipation, something really important happened in 1850. Before 1850, waiters in America were mostly men. They were largely white men, and they actually received a full minimum wage. They went on strike in 1850 in a number of cities across the country, and restaurant owners, in retaliation, replaced them with women. So women entered the industry in the millions prior to emancipation. And at emancipation, of course, Black people also entered the industry. With the entrance of women and Black people, the wage went from a full wage down to zero. Because at emancipation, the restaurant industry wanted the ability to hire Black people, not pay them anything, and have them live exclusively on tips, which was a mutation of the original notion of tipping. Tipping originated in Europe as an extra or bonus on top of the wage. It became a replacement for wages. Why? Because of the devaluation of Black lives and women's work. And it's so important. Nobody can understand this sub-minimum wage as anything other than a devaluation of Black lives and women's work and a legacy of slavery. That became law in 1938 when everybody got the right to the federal minimum wage for the first time as part of the New Deal, except for millions of Black workers, farm workers, domestic workers, and tipped restaurant workers were left out and told, you can get a $0 wage from your boss as long as you get tips. And we went from a $0 wage in 1938 all the way up to the ridiculous and absurd $2.13 an hour today. Today, as you said, more than 2/3 of tipped workers are women. They are in vast majority women who work in very casual restaurants, not just IHOPs and Denny's, but small mom and pop restaurants across America. As you said, and it bears repeating, they struggle with 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the US workforce. They use food stamps at double the rate. No matter what you want to say, the Restaurant Association argues with us over how much these workers actually make. They say, oh, they don't report their tips. We don't know how much they make. Well, we know they use food stamps at double the rate of the rest of the US workforce. And applying for food stamps, as some of these workers can tell you, is difficult and stigmatized. It's not something you do for extra money to go to the prom. So the fact that these workers are on food stamps indicates their level of inability to live on a $2 wage plus tips. Worst of all, as you mentioned, we know that because they're having to struggle on a $2 wage plus tips, they are having to put up with the absolute worst sexual harassment of any industry in the United States because they have to tolerate all kinds of inappropriate behavior to feed their families and tips. They're dependent on the customers. And although the law says the employer is supposed to make sure that tips make up the difference between the sub-minimum wage and the regular minimum wage, under the Obama administration, when we had the highest levels of government enforcement of that law, we saw an 84% violation rate, according to the Obama administration, with employers actually ensuring that tips make up the difference. That's a 16% compliance rate. But even if you had 100% compliance and every restaurant went and counted how many tips did you get and did that bring you to the full minimum wage, you'd still have a majority female workforce having to tolerate inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families and tips. And that is the core problem here. The vulnerability of these workers because they have to put up with whatever the customer does to them, however they touch them or treat them or talk to them, because the customer is always right. Now, there are 7 states that do this differently: California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska, not all blue states. These 7 states require all workers, tipped workers, to be paid a full minimum wage with tips on top. Restaurant industry is actually growing faster in those states. Job growth is higher. Small business growth rates are higher. And tipping rates are higher in those 7 states than they are in the 43 states with a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. We've heard that there are some fine dining servers in sub-minimum wage states who say, oh, I'm worried if I get a wage, will I be able to make as much money in tips? The truth is that even the highest tipped, highest fine dining restaurant workers in San Francisco and Alaska, all over these 7 states, make more money in tips than their counterparts, in the 43 states with a sub-minimum wage. So everything is better, including, maybe most importantly, in these 7 states, we see 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment. Why? Because when you pay a woman a full minimum wage in California or Alaska or Montana, she doesn't have to put up with so much harassment from the customer. She can actually say no when a customer tries to harass her because she can count on a wage from her boss like every other worker in every other industry. Now, all of these issues became so much worse during the pandemic. 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs, and 60%, 60, could not get unemployment insurance because in most cases they were told their wages were too low to meet the minimum threshold to qualify for benefits. Then they were forced to go back to work before they felt safe. And when they did, they weren't safe. They were asked to do so much more for so much less. They were asked to enforce social distancing and mask rules on the very same customers from whom they had to get tips in a moment when tips are way down, 50 to 75%, because sales are down. But worst of all, as you mentioned, more than 40% of workers said sexual harassment went way up during the pandemic, and hundreds of women reported that they're being asked to remove their masks so men can judge their looks and their tips on that basis. That has changed this issue from an injustice to life-threatening, and the time is up. We've got to end this. What we are calling for, what hundreds of women have written to President Biden and Senator Schumer, and 140,000 workers have written, as you said, in petitions to the president and Senator Schumer, is that we're fine, perhaps with a longer timeline, as you mentioned, but we have to end this sub-minimum wage. We have to get to 100%. And workers, hundreds of workers in each of the states where the senators are saying they don't want this or they're worried, hundreds of workers have said, we want this, we need this now. Enough is enough.
No, Saru, thank you so much for that cogent presentation. And you made a couple of important points that need to be repeated, is that many workers are earning wages so low that they can't even get unemployment. How crazy is that? And that because of the pandemic, there's an additional burden. Suddenly a waitress becomes a health enforcer. Not exactly what she signed up for, having to tell somebody who may not want to put on a mask, or you have to socially distance yourself. And that's above and beyond everything else that that worker has to do. So thanks very much for what you and One Fair Wage are doing. And we're going to win this thing because of your efforts. And tonight, as I mentioned earlier, what is exciting about tonight, what I love to do, is not just hear from academicians, but to hear from people who are involved in the struggle on a day-to-day basis. And that's who we're going to hear from tonight. We're going to begin with Heather Mcintosh, who has worked as a tip professional in the restaurant industry for 25 years. She is a single mom and is joining us from Portland, Maine. Heather, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Senator Sanders. Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Mcintosh. I'm a leader in One Fair Wage from Portland, Maine, and I've lived in the Portland area for many years. I'm a single mom of a 12-year-old boy. I've worked in the restaurant industry for 25 years as a tipped worker in various roles, including server and bartender. I personally have had to rely on food stamps to feed my son because I didn't earn enough in tips to survive. I'm lucky to have a job currently, but many other service industry workers throughout Maine have not been able to work. Due to COVID-19, my hours were cut substantially. We were closed from March through July. This affected my livelihood, and I was almost evicted from my home. I also had to rely on a food pantry to feed my son. For many Maine tipped workers who earn a sub-minimum wage, we weren't able to access unemployment insurance or any other government benefits, including accessing stimulus checks, all because the government didn't have a record of our tips and told us our sub-minimum wages were too low to qualify for benefits. It has been really stressful having to enforce COVID-19 safety protocols and ensure that customers abide by the CDC mandates. Where I work, people were coming in from out of state, not wanting to observe quarantine protocols and not wanting to wear masks. This has been especially hard because we are expected to be the public health marshals and enforce mask mandates, but at the same time, we rely on those same customers for tips. So if we strike a wrong nerve, they may decide they don't want to tip us at all. I have seen a lot of people I know in the service industry struggling so much because tips are down significantly during the pandemic, as much as 50 to 70% from what they were pre-pandemic. I personally have experienced decades of sexual harassment as a tipped worker because I had to tolerate harassment to get tips. Managers would tell me to dress more sexually to make more money in tips, and then managers would take advantage of that to harass me themselves. At one point, a restaurant owner offered me sexually to a friend of his. Paying tipped workers a full minimum wage would mean that we would not have to tolerate abuse in order to support our families. I have worked in states that pay one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top, including in California, and my tips never suffered. Let me say that again, my tips never suffered. So the false presumption that tips will go away if our wages go up is simply not true. I earned the same tips or better during my time working in California. People still tipped, and at the end of the day, we had a fair full wage to fall back on when business was slow. In 2016, when there was a ballot measure in Maine to end the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, my employer told me I had to attend anti-minimum wage meetings or I would get fired. At these meetings, they told us our tips would go away if our wages went up. That's how I know many of the workers that legislators might be hearing from about this issue have actually been forced or lied to by their employers to advocate against their own interest or face losing their jobs. Maine is a very seasonal state, so in the winter months, having one fair wage could be a lifesaver for restaurant workers. It could literally be the difference between life and death and people going hungry. We have over 140,000 workers who have signed on to a petition to support one fair wage. In Maine, 300 tipped workers have signed on, and that number is growing by the day. Tips are so low, people aren't listening as much anymore to the NRA's lies. The majority of my service colleagues in Maine want one fair wage with tips on top. Thank you.
Heather, thank you very much. Our next panelist is Gabrielle Magnus, who's from Detroit, Michigan, and has worked in the service industry for 11 years as a tip worker in many positions. Gabrielle, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Senator Sanders. Thank you, Saru, for also having me the pleasure to be on this platform with everyone this evening. My name is Gabrielle Magnus. I am a one fair wage worker leader in Detroit, Michigan. I have been working in the service industry for 11 years as a tipped worker. I've worked positions as a busser, a server, a barback, and a cashier. I have worked in casual dining restaurants such as Denny's, Outback Steakhouse, an array of different style restaurants from laid-back barbecue chain restaurants to upscale finer dining establishments. I'm here to dispel the notion that tipped workers earn enough money to make it off of tips alone. We deserve the right to live without struggle. We deserve the right to fair wages. We need a full fair wage plus tips on top that is representative of the hard work that we put in and day out. I have also had to tolerate sexual harassment from managers, coworkers, and customers because I was dependent on tips to survive. When grinding to support yourself, you are exposed to new experiences and environments along your journey. For many young women, the restaurant industry is our first experience in the workforce. Years ago, when I started working in the service industry, I was a victim unknowingly to sexual harassment at work. I would be scheduled to work private events with the general manager and his selective team that kept a very tight mouth on anything that would count as misconduct. I have been touched below the waist and then warned against losing my job if I didn't stay in my lane or keep it in place, ultimately led to shifts being eliminated from the owner because I was a disruption for speaking out. I found it particularly exclusive to the men that held power in the workplace, who were very territorial and confrontational when up against. Worst of all, I felt a sense of powerlessness because I relied on the manager to schedule my shifts. And everyone in the industry knows different shifts can mean a lot in tips or in little tips. I had to let them do what they wanted, and I couldn't say anything when they made me feel uncomfortable because my livelihood depended on it. Women of color face more discrimination across every industry. Women of color tipped workers earn less money than white men tipped workers because of customer discrimination. As a tipped worker, the tip is optional. There is no running down a customer to ask them why or to complain about discrimination. If there's nothing on the table left for you, then there's nothing left on the table for you. You say you want to end gender injustices and sexual harassment. You say you want to end racial inequality. These are huge issues in our industry. And the most effective way to put a stop to them is to pay all workers a full, fair wage. All of my colleagues in the restaurant industry agree. We need one fair wage, a full, fair minimum wage with tips on top. Thank you.
Gabrielle, thank you very much. Our next panelist is John J.J. Waters. John has worked as a bartender in the restaurant industry for the last 25 years. He is an artist and social media manager, and he is joining us from Huntington, West Virginia. John, thanks for being with us. I think, John, you got to deal with your mute.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. The common misconception is that tipped workers tend to be teenagers with very few responsibilities or bills to pay. As a West Virginian, 42-year-old father, and a proud 25-year veteran of the service industry, I'm here to challenge that notion. I need my elected officials to hear us when we say that living off a sub-minimum wage is more common than you think, and the sub-minimum wage is not enough for any way to live. All the service professionals I know struggle with the same bills as any other American, which is why they deserve to have a full, fair wage, the same as every other American. When the pandemic began, I, like most workers, was sent home as the place I worked closed. Initially, unemployment insurance helped, but once the second round of federal unemployment aid was announced, I no longer qualified due to the fact my wages were too low. For all intents and purposes, I was declared too poor for unemployment insurance due to the sub-minimum wage. Since returning, the decline in tips has been stark. Most of us are going to work now for significantly less money in a more dangerous condition with expanded duties. We're expected to handle unruly and antagonistic customers who refuse to follow safety guidelines with grace. Not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because relying on their tips or wages, they hold our very livelihoods in their hands. If we were earning a true, full, and fair minimum wage with tips on top, we would not be in such a dismal position. Living on the biases and whims of customers is unacceptable. My rent should not be dependent on their mood or having to put up with sexual harassment, as many of my female colleagues do. My partner and I live in a household where both of us earn the sub-minimum wage. It is difficult at the best of times. We often have to sit down at the end of the week and decide which bills we're going to pay and which ones will simply have to wait. With the pay we have and making decisions about which bills to pay, it's hard to qualify for a credit card, get a loan, or car lease. There have been many nights where our transportation to and from work, which is usually Uber or Lyft, has been more than what we made that day. This past year has thrown just how tenuous our situation is into a harsh light. I need my representatives to hear the majority of us tipped workers in West Virginia who are living off of sub-minimum wage that it's not any way to live. The word minimum exists for a reason. It is unconscionable to literally pay people below what is already supposed to be the bottom. Thank you.
JJ, thanks very much. Our next panelist is Shelly Ortiz, who has worked as a server in the restaurant industry for 10 years and has been organizing her fellow workers for better wages since the pandemic began. Shelly is joining us from Phoenix, Arizona. Shelly, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Shelly Ortiz, and I am a leader in One Fair Wage. I started in the food industry 10 years ago when I was 15 in Phoenix, Arizona. In 2019, I had finally got a job that I worked really hard for at a local restaurant with high expectations. Then when the pandemic hit and restaurants reopened, it was a scary time for all of us. The whole environment changed. I'm a naturally anxious person, but this was a whole other layer of stress. I was double masking. I wore fake glasses to protect my eyes. I took every precaution I could. I feel like after time, my coworkers somewhat adjusted to the stress, normalizing it, even though daily, and I wasn't so easy to adjust. I felt very disposable. I have an at-risk father who was recovering from a heart attack at that time, so it was important for me not to risk anyone else getting sick. But we had no choice but to work. Because we get a sub-minimum wage, we have to go to work no matter what to get tips to survive. Not only did the regulars change, but the whole demographic changed and tips went down. I had customers telling me how much of a hoax this was, and having a mother as a nurse fighting COVID in New York at the time, it was infuriating. The worst experience I had was with an older gentleman and his wife. He was the type of customer who required a lot of time and attention. And at the end of service, I dropped his check. He asked me to take off my mask so he could see if the bottom of my face was as cute as the top. I told him no. And he told me because he couldn't focus on my face, he was forced to focus on my breasts. And this was in front of his wife. I was humiliated. I felt disrespected. I only had a few minutes to process and recover from this before I was back on the floor again. Again, because I earned the sub-minimum wage and needed his tips to make my base wage, there was nothing I could do but put up with it. This is one of the many times I've been asked to take off my mask, and each time I felt that my tips and my income are at risk if I don't comply. This is just some of my story. There are so many more awful stories around the country, and I take pride in my experience in the service industry. I am a professional. With that being said, servers have to tolerate highest levels of sexual harassment because we are dependent on customers' tips to survive. With the pandemic, things have only gotten worse. Servers are expected to enforce safety rules at the restaurant with no additional compensation, and it often affects our income because customers tip us less when we enforce these rules. Raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour for tipped workers with tips on top would greatly impact tipped workers. So we have a leg to stand on in situations like these. This is not only what I want, but everyone in my food industry community wants. It is essential for our survival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shelly. Our next panelist is Gail Summers, who's based in Keene, New Hampshire, and is the owner of Yacht Show Jamaican Grill, which features authentic Jamaican cuisine, as well as modern Caribbean American fusion dishes. Sounds good. Gail, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you, Senator Sanders, for having us tonight and listening and hearing our voices. I'm a small business owner from New Hampshire. I'm a leader in the Raise High Road Restaurants, an association of over 850 restaurants that support the one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top. I believe in paying a full minimum wage with tips on top. If I can make it work as a small business owner, then I think all the fine dining restaurants and big corporate chain restaurants can make it work as well. Most tip workers don't work in fine dining restaurants. A lot of them work in casual restaurants like mine, where the tips are even less. And most of them need to be paid this full minimum wage with tips on top. Small restaurants need workers in all restaurants, not just casual or fine dining. All restaurants to be paid enough to eat out. Personally, for me, a restaurant is a key part of the community. And as a restaurant owner, I want to know that my employees can afford to eat out at other restaurants. We also need workers to be willing to come back to work, and we can't afford if over 40% of workers leave the industry because tips and wages are too low. I strongly believe that we can make a $15 minimum wage with tips on top work. If wages go up, consumption power goes up. We as restaurant owners are able to raise prices slightly and still enjoy enough profits. And I say that, Senator Sanders, because a lot of restaurant owners who oppose this may say that it's not going to be profitable for them. I believe strongly that we need to pay and treat people like the professionals they are. We're not advocating for tips to go away. From an equality perspective, having everyone paid a fair wage and allowing tips to be shared between the back of the house and the front of the house is crucial to create equality and camaraderie among the whole staff. Even as a small business owner, whenever major restaurant industry operator gets to pay a sub-minimum wage, that's bad business for me, and it undermines my ability to operate responsible. In order to incentivize high road employers like me who want to do the right thing, the government has to have our back. So we need Congress to pass this one fair wage now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gail. And next time I'm in Keene, I'm going to drop in. How's that?
Sounds great. You're not too far away.
No, we're not. Let me do this. I'm going to introduce Saru in a moment. And then we're going to do some questions and answers. But I have a question I'd like to throw out, and Saru or anybody else can answer it. My experience many years ago as a waiter is that you got to get to the job early. You know, you got to set up and you got to do this and you got to do that. Do you get paid for that? And you don't get any tips when you are setting up. Is that an issue? That's issue number one. And Saru mentioned a study done during the Obama years, which showed that the overwhelming majority of service workers did not get the difference between their tips and their state's minimum wage. So does anyone want to jump in on that issue? Is it an issue that people have to get to work early and simply, I guess, are getting $2.13 an hour for that labor? Is that an issue? And what about whether people are getting the difference between their tips and the state's minimum wage? Anyone have anything to say on that?
I'm going to start, and then I'll let everybody just to share some data, and then I'd really love it if our friends here can share their stories as well. But listen, what you're describing of not getting paid, so getting a sub-minimum wage when you're not getting tips is called wage theft, because the employer is not actually doing what they're supposed to do, which is pay you a full minimum wage when there are no tips, and then ensure that when you're getting tips, they bring you to the full minimum wage. It's called wage theft. The US Department of Labor has said under the Obama administration that the restaurant industry has the absolute highest levels of wage theft of any industry in the United States. The lack of compliance with paying the minimum wage, ensuring that tips bring you to the full minimum wage, making sure that you're paid for all the hours you work is the worst in the restaurant industry than any other industry. Now, there are amazing employers like Gail and so many others who work so hard to try to comply with these rules. But here's the thing. These rules are complicated. Anytime you have 2 tiers of wages and having to count every tip and make sure it makes it to the full minimum wage, that's complicated. So the fact that there's such high levels of non-compliance, and the stat was that not that 83% of workers didn't get there, but that 83% of restaurants studied were not complying with these rules. But we feel for a lot of small business owners, it's hard to comply with these rules. And that's why having just one wage is so much cleaner and easier. In fact, in a recent study we did, we found that restaurants in California have 1/3 the level of litigation or lawsuits as restaurants in New York, because they don't have to deal with 2 tiers of wages or counting the amount of tips or making sure you're getting a full minimum wage when you don't get tips and making sure other times you do. Whereas all the small businesses like Gail's restaurant, all the rest of the country have to do this constant calculation, which is very hard to do. So look, it's better for workers and employers to have a full minimum wage with tips on top, rather than constantly relying on employers to ensure that tips bring you to the full minimum wage. What I would love workers to comment on, JJ, Heather, Shelly, Gabrielle, is whether actually you've ever had an employer go back and count every tip you made and whether it brought you to the full minimum wage, whether you've ever seen that happen.
Okay, jump in, anybody.
So this is Heather. I can speak to that. I've never had that happen. And I just want to state, living in Maine, where winter impacts reservations, and oftentimes inclement weather, people will cancel their reservations. The expectation is for us to come into work, clock in, and then they will let us go if there are no reservations at around 7 or 8. So I go in at 3:00, I get out at 8, I work for 5 hours for $10. And I've worked at some restaurants that—
Heather, and that is, are you telling me that is the fact?
Yeah.
You've experienced that?
That's common. And the other thing is, in some restaurants tell you not to clock in because they're probably going to cut you because there's not enough tables for the staff, because they think that we are disposable. They want to make sure that there's enough, servers in there just in case, and then they cut you. It's very common in the industry. And if you try to speak to it, then you get your shifts cut, and you make most of your money on Friday and Saturday nights, period, but especially in what we call the off season. Summertime, we all make money, but summertime is short in New England. It's, 8 weeks if we're lucky. So if you don't have those Friday and Saturday night shifts in the off season, you do not make enough money to survive.
Okay, anybody else want to jump in? Shelly, I see you nodding your head. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to touch on a point that Heather mentioned. There's a lot of times that I would be scheduled for 4. I would get to the restaurant, and because they didn't want to pay my hourly and didn't want to split the tips more so that they would have to count, I would be waiting sometimes for 3 hours until it got busy, until 8, and then I would work for maybe 3 hours, and then my 3 hours would be the amount that I would be tipped. which would be close to nothing, right?
So you would wait around for 3 hours and make nothing?
Yeah, I would just wait for them to want to clock me in.
Okay, this is a huge issue. I remember
Illegal, but it's
a number of years ago on another subject. I was in Florida working, taking a look at migrant tomato pickers. And what would happen to these people who were paid terribly, they were paid per bushel, is they would get to work and they would have to hang around, depending on the weather, depending on a number of facts, sometimes for hours, before they were able to pick and make some money. And that's what I'm hearing from you guys, is that there are times you're just not getting paid anything. Anyone else want to pick up on that point? Or anybody have thoughts on that one?
Senator, I've also found that where the law is so confusing, as far as employers making up the amount of tips to get to the minimum wage, is many employers don't even know the ins and outs of how that works, like how often they're supposed to be factoring that in. You know, if someone makes a lot of money on Friday night but makes nothing on Saturday, are they supposed to make up the wages on Saturday, or can they add that up weekly as far as how much has been made? The law is so convoluted that it's difficult for anyone to follow.
Okay. I think, Saru, do you want to add anything, or we can go to the questions?
I do want to add one thing before we go to the questions, which is just every single one of these workers has said that everybody they know wants one fair wage. And the data shows that the vast majority of workers in America want this. I just wanted to share, we did polling in 2019 of tipped workers alone, not the general public. 85% of workers in Massachusetts, 87% in Mississippi, 91% in Pennsylvania said they wanted one fair wage with tips on top. And with the pandemic, as Heather mentioned, it's just gotten so much worse that the number of workers that want this has exploded. So 140,000 workers signed petitions. But I do want to specifically say, from the states where some senators are saying they're hearing from workers who don't want this, we have 300 petitions from New Hampshire, 400 from West Virginia, 200 from Delaware, and 1,767 petitions from Arizona. People want this and need this. And in fact, without getting it, here's a big problem. We just did a survey of workers in New York. 41% of restaurant workers are saying they're considering leaving the industry because the wages and the tips are too low. So how are we going to save the restaurant industry if there's nobody to work in it when we fully reopen? We have to ensure workers are able to stay in this industry and do the work. And I just want to say, today is Equal Pay Day. We didn't mention that. Today is Equal Pay Day. Happy Equal Pay Day, I guess, if it's a happy thing. But we cannot talk about women earning 83 cents on the man's dollar and then in the same breath be trying to legislate tipped workers at 50 or 60 or 70 or any percentage of a wage. Tipped workers are overwhelmingly women. If we leave them behind at any percent of the wage, we can't talk about equal pay. We can't talk about Black Lives Matter and sustain a legacy of slavery. The time is up.
I would just pick up on one point you made, Saru. I just talked to a senator who told me that all of the calls that came into that office were in opposition to one wage. That's all that they received. But, okay. Ms. Lee, I think we are going to have some questions. Do we have any?
Yeah, we do. And I actually want to start with this first one because I think it is the question that is on a lot of people's minds after hearing these incredible stories from these people on the front lines who are telling you exactly what their experiences are. And Senator, to the point you just made up, if this benefits millions of people, why are so many people against it? And this is from Cynthia. And I think this is an important question to answer because there are a lot of myths out there. And if we have a senator out there saying they're getting calls from people saying that they don't want this, so we know this benefits of people on this live stream want it, all the people that Saru just talked about. Saru, so why are some people against it? What's your hunch?
First of all, it's not true that so many people are against it. There's a very small minority that's against it. They are the 1%. They lead the National Restaurant Association. They have scared some small business owners and some workers into believing it's a bad thing, but the vast majority of Americans and restaurant workers know differently. Listen, We know that one of the senators who voted no on the Raise the Wage Act is Senator Manchin, and we're counting on him to change his vote. But we did a poll in West Virginia, in Senator Manchin's state. We found that 63% of West Virginians want a $15 minimum wage when they're told that 43% of West Virginians earn less, including paramedics. But 66% of Virginians, including 52% of Republicans in West Virginia, said that they believe in a full minimum wage for tipped workers with tips on top. Before they were told anything about who tipped workers are, they overwhelmingly support. When you ask most people in America and workers, should tipped workers get a full minimum wage? Most Americans say, wait a second, I thought they already were getting a full minimum wage. Most people overwhelmingly support this. It is a small echo chamber around the Senate that they are hearing and they are listening to, and we need them to hear the millions of people who support this.
All right. So we're getting a lot of questions about what you just said, Saru, the disbelief that there is a tip minimum wage. But I'm gonna skip over that and go to this next one, which I think is another sort of myth that we hear or concern we hear. And this comes from someone on social media as well, from Brian C. Brian asks, how will this impact small businesses? I'm all for it, but will this harm businesses in any way? Gail, do you want to take that one?
Absolutely. I think first, let me call out something, and Saru said it well, but I just want to echo it. We are not advocating for tips to go away. And I think that's where some of this fear and concern is coming from. So I just needed to reiterate that. But also, as a small business owner, I think that the piece that doesn't get enough attention is the fact that consumption will go up when the minimum wage go up. And there's no reason for the restaurant industry to be excluded from that. Most restaurant owners will tell you that with the stimulus payments that came through, they saw some bump in consumption. I saw some bump in consumption during that period. And I think that's just one immediate example to show you that if our everyday working people have more money in their pocket, what will they do? They will go out and support businesses like mine. So we're talking about an economic recovery. We're talking about Black Lives Matter. We're talking about one fair wage. We're talking about equal pay. I think that they all connect in some way. And it's important that we address this issue of people needing some sort of fair minimum wage to live on. You know, the right word is a living wage, right? But I do believe strongly, and economics tell you that as a business owner, if consumption, if income goes up, consumption goes up, and we can all do the right thing and treat people and pay people. As an immigrant, as a person of color, these are strong things for me personally. But I think once you look at it, if we can give people more money in their pocket and make sure that they're living at least in a way that they can take care of their family, consumption will go up. And as small business owners and other business owners, we will do fine.
Thank you, Gail. Okay, I'm going to move on to a few more. We're getting some from some small business owners. One small business owner wrote in, as a small business owner, would I have access to any sort of help for payroll? This comes from Sam F. Any thoughts on that?
I'll just chime in for a quick second. I don't know about help on payroll, but another thing that Senator Sanders pointed out earlier is the fact that we are not talking about jumping from where we are at the federal minimum wage now to an immediate $15 per hour. So I think the time will allow for adjustment, not only in slight prices, but for a gradual adjustment to the to food consumption, food prices, restaurant menu pricing.
And I would just add, go ahead, Senator.
That answers the question somewhat.
Let me jump in if I might, and say this to that's the small businessman who raised the question. 2 points. Number one, as a result of the COVID relief packages, hundreds of billions of dollars, many hundreds of billions, have already gone to small businesses and to restaurants as well. In fact, the last $1.9 trillion program had a very generous benefit for restaurants. Second of all, what we are prepared to consider is what has been the case in the past, is that when we pass this minimum wage bill, to provide additional help for small businesses who might have some problems with it.
I have another question. I think this is a really good one. So this comes from a worker in Maine. When I was a tip worker in Maine, my employer would not allow me to report tips in order to evade payroll taxes. Have you all heard of that one before? I know you have. Asking that of our restaurant workers. If workers are prevented from reporting tips as income, employers save money in matching payroll taxes. What does One Fair Wage say regarding these issues? Saru, do you want to take that?
I can start, and then other people. It's so interesting because, I've been organizing restaurant workers for 20 years, and through that entire time, restaurant workers have gotten blamed. As long as I've been organizing workers, they get blamed for not reporting their tips. But we've heard the truth of what the person is saying from so many workers, that it's not that workers don't want to report. It's often that employers don't want to report because they don't want to pay additional taxes, or they just don't actually bother with calculating how many tips are coming in and reporting it. And that is what resulted in so many millions of workers not getting unemployment insurance. I'll give you an example from Michigan. We had a worker leader in Michigan who, with the pandemic, lost her job at a very small bar in a small town in Michigan, a mother. And she said, I reported my tips religiously and paid taxes religiously to the IRS. But because my employer never reported my tips, I was denied unemployment insurance because the state of Michigan said my income was too low to qualify for benefits. And to JJ's point, this is what makes it hard for tipped workers to get credit, buy a house, get a loan, do anything that other workers, other professionals are able to do, which makes it hard to save or get ahead or ever improve your situation if you're not able to access just basic things because your income is so variable. I don't know, JJ, if you want to share the story of what happened to you.
Yeah, just prior to the pandemic, I had been house hunting, and my credit score is near 800. It's a pretty high score. But time and time again, I was told that I couldn't get a loan for a house because of the unpredictability of my wages because of the industry I worked in. So even though I was making enough money to pay rent, I was apparently to the banks was not making enough money to guarantee that I could make a house payment simply because of what my wages were reported as.
Yeah, so many times workers are asked to bring in a pay stub as proof, right? To get a loan or to get even, to get an apartment. Okay, let's move on to one very important, this is probably the last question we have time for, and then we'll get into how everybody who's watching right now can help us raise the wage. It says, this comes from Tim from Chicago. If we eliminate the tipped wage, will we also be eliminating tipping culture? I know so many people who are lucky enough to make good money when money's flowing and people are out. So I wouldn't want that to affect their source of income. So the question is, if we get rid of the sub-tip minimum wage, the $13 an hour, does that mean we get rid of tipping culture? Heather, you said that you had actually worked in California where there is not a sub-tip minimum wage. Did that happen? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I've worked mostly in like beach towns. When I was in California, I did live and work in San Francisco. And 20% is what we in the industry like to call is good and sort of the expectation. In some places, people don't tip that, but for everyone listening, tip your servers at least 20%. And I can say that I made, on average, 20 to 25% in tips every single night. So it didn't negatively impact. And the folks that I worked with, I didn't hear from any other folks in California that didn't get tipped. And quite honestly, I think most people, like Saru said, have no idea that we make less. They think that we make the same as everyone else, and that tipping has always been part of the culture, and it didn't go away in California and other states that have, a one minimum wage for everyone. So I think that that is a scare tactic that the NRA uses. And in my experience, in my 25 years, I've never, ever heard one story of anyone being tipped less in one of those states.
Can I just add that, sorry, that the states with one fair wage actually have higher tipping averages because people get paid more. And anybody who's ever worked in the industry knows restaurant workers tip better than other workers because they know what it's like to work in the industry. So when restaurant workers get paid more, they tip more, which is why San Francisco has the highest tipping average of any city in the United States. And they've had one fair wage for 50 years. And Alaska has the highest tipping average of any state in the US. And they've had one fair wage for decades. So I just would ask one question of everybody listening. Have you ever asked your server when you eat out, how much do you earn before you tip? Or has any server listening ever been asked that question? It's just not how or why people tip. People have no idea how much you make, nor do they care.
I know we didn't get a chance to get to everyone again, but the question I think on a lot of people's minds right now is, no doubt, we need to raise this wage from $2.13. It's been since 1938 since tipped workers have gotten a raise in this country. That's ridiculous. So the question that I'm going to ask to kind of close us out here is, what can we do on the ground to make this a reality? How can all the people watching and tuning in tonight come and have the back of Senator Sanders, who has been fighting like crazy in the Senate to make this happen? What can folks do? Saru?
Thank you. And I'm sorry to have talked so much. I really appreciate all of the workers who've shared their stories. Thank you so much. And thank you, Senator Sanders, for doing this, and Misty for doing this, and Gail. Listen, there are three things we're hoping everybody will do. One is to go to One Fair Wage, onefairwage.org/take-action. onefairwage.org/take-action. There you can send a letter very easily. It's already pre-prepared to the senators who have voted no, to tell them to vote yes. They're counting on them to vote yes. Number two, in that same link, it gives you a number. You can call those senators and tell them, we need you to pass one fair wage. We can get there over a longer timeline, but we need 100% for tipped workers. And lastly, if you are a current tipped worker or you ever worked in the industry, please join us in sharing your stories so we can hear from everybody who's ever worked as a tipped worker why we need one fair wage. And you can do that at onefairwage.org/stories, onefairwage.org/stories. Join us. We, as Senator Sanders said, we can get this done.
Well, let me thank Saru and all of our great panelists. Thank you so much. At the end of the day, a senator or anybody else could give long speeches, but what is far more important is for the public to hear from people who are experiencing the reality of what we're talking about. And what we are talking about are millions of people in this country struggling to put food on the table, to live with dignity, to earn a living wage. And many people, as we've discussed tonight, in the service industry are not in that position. So I want to thank you all again. This is a great evening. And let's go forward together. And if we do, we're going to win this thing and make sure that everybody in the industry earns what they deserve. So thank you all very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.